Good evening. My name is Erez Levon, and I'd like to thank you all for coming to the third annual Jenny Cheshire Lecture in Sociolinguistics. As many of you know, we established this lecture series in 2011 as a way of expressing our gratitude to Jenny for all that she's done both for the linguistics department here at Queen Mary and for the field of linguistics more broadly. It's great to have so many of you with us here this evening to once again share in our celebration of Jenny and of her work. I'd also like to thank the School of Languages, Linguistics and Film at Queen Mary for their continued support of the lecture series, as well as both Wiley Blackwell and Palgrave Macmillan, who have very generously supported the reception that will follow the lecture. It is my pleasure to be able to introduce tonight's speaker, Jennifer Coates, Emeritus Professor of English Language and Linguistics at Roehampton University. I'm personally very honored to be up here this evening, as both Jenny and Jennifer have had a profound impact on my career as a linguist and as a scholar of language and gender. Back when I was an undergraduate student of linguistics in the United States, I came to spend a year abroad here at Queen Mary. And it was during that year that I first took classes in sociolinguistics and in language and gender studies, both of which were taught by Jenny Cheshire. This was in 1998, and in that language and gender class, Jenny assigned us a new book, hot off the press. The book was entitled Language and Gender, a Reader, and it was edited by Jennifer Coates. Like many of the people in this room, I devoured every single page of that book, and over the course of that semester, I decided that studying language and gender was what I wanted to do. So I owe an enormous debt of gratitude, both to Jenny and to Jen, for their enormous contributions that they've made, both to the field and to me personally. This anecdote, I think, serves to illustrate the impact that Jen Coates' work has had and continues to have throughout linguistics. In addition to countless journal articles and book chapters, Jen is the author or editor of 11 books, including The Semantics of Auxiliaries, published by Routledge in 1983, Women, Men, and Language, first published by Longman in 1986, with new editions appearing in 1993 and 2004, Women Talk, Conversations Between Women Friends, published by Blackwell in 1996, and Men Talk, Stories in the Making of Masculinities, published by Blackwell in 2003. Not to mention that Language and Gender Reader that came out in 1998, the second edition of which, co-edited with Pia Pickler, was published by Blackwell in 2011. This is obviously a very impressive list of publications, but what is even more impressive about Jen's work is its continued relevance to everything that language and gender scholars are doing. I have never in my career seen a language and gender class, including the ones that I teach, that doesn't assign at least 3 or 4 of Jen's pieces as required reading, and the themes that Jen touches on in her work, including the relationship between linguistic form and social identity, the ways in which gender and sexuality emerge in conversational interaction, and the overriding question of how social ideologies structure linguistic practice. All of these remain absolutely central to the field. It is therefore very much my pleasure to invite Jennifer Coates, one of the formative scholars of language and gender studies, to deliver tonight's Jenny Cheshire Lecture in Sociolinguistics on the topic of the discursive construction of everyday heterosexualities.
Thank you very much indeed, Eris, for that very generous introduction. And lovely to see you all here tonight. And I'm greatly honoured that I was invited to be one of the people speaking on the Jenny Cheshire series. I've known Jenny for many, many years. In fact, we met first at a sociolinguistic symposium somewhere in the north, I think Sheffield, where we were introduced by Peter Trudgill, who said to me, "There's someone here I want you to meet. I think the two of you will get on." And he was absolutely right, we did. We went on to be co-editors of a series that I set up at Longman called Real Language, and we then invited you and Reed to join us. So we were editors together, we are colleagues, and we've been friends as well. So it's been a long history of linguistic colleagueship, and I'm very, very happy to be here tonight. So, has everyone got a handout? There are places where you will need a handout because it's not going to be on the overhead. The discursive production of everyday heterosexualities. Millions of people all over the world watched the royal wedding in April 2011, when Prince William, heir to the British throne, married Catherine Middleton. The drama of the coming together in a public arena of a man and a woman in a heterosexual union was accentuated by the emphasis on gender difference and on gender normativity in the self-presentation of the bride and groom. Their clothes conform to gender norms in every way. The bride in a white dress with a long train, a veil and a diamond tiara, and carrying a posy of white flowers. The groom in army uniform with a red jacket and black trousers with a red stripe down the side. Notice what a contrast there is. The bride's all in white, which obviously symbolises modesty and probably meant to symbolise virginity, and the groom very, very strongly contrasted with either black or red being the dominant colours, and then he's got this blue sash and all sorts of gold bits on the cuffs and on the shoulders. So, for most of those watching, the fact that the ceremony involved one male and one female and celebrated their official coming together as a heterosexual couple would have been totally unremarkable. In Western culture, getting married is viewed as the taken-for-granted endpoint of the heterosexual romantic journey. People watched because of the spectacle, the royal coaches, the wedding dress, the ancient cathedral, the music, the Archbishop of Canterbury in all his finery, and the various members of the royal family. People watched because of the spectacle, but a wedding such as this one, very much in the public eye, does enormous ideological work, reaffirming what is normal and acceptable in Britain today. A traditional wedding is one of the most visible symbols in our society of heteronormativity. The term heteronormativity was coined in 1991 and lexicalizes what is probably the most important insight of queer theory. That is, that sexuality is organized and regulated in accordance with certain societal beliefs about what is normal, natural, and desirable. It forces us to understand that heterosexuality is a cultural construction relying on strictly enforced norms for its continued dominance. Queer theory developed in the early 1990s out of work in feminist and LGBT studies. It aims to debunk the idea of stable sexes, genders, and sexualities. It inquires into the nature and workings of heteronormativity and examines how heterosexuality is actively produced in specific socio-cultural contexts and situated interactions. What I want to do is to focus on specific socio-cultural contexts and situated interactions to show how heteronormativity is discursively produced. Queer linguistics is still a relatively new field. Early work in queer linguistics had the sexual and gender deviance of previous generations at its centre. So early research focused on the language of gay, lesbian, bisexual and transgender communities, and I've given you some examples on the slide. But queer linguistics encompasses more than this. As Don Kulick argues, the term queer should not be invoked just as a blithe new synonym for gay and lesbian. Queering the sociolinguistic approach to gender and sexuality means challenging the unmarked status of heterosexuality. More recently, queer linguistics has focused more on heterosexuality and heteronormativity, and examples of recent research include those listed here. You can see there's been a shift, though of course there's still work going on gay and lesbian language, for example, but if I just very briefly talk about two of them. The first one, Joanna Rendell-Short, she looked at people phoning in to a radio programme in Australia, and what she observed was that people were very happy to identify themselves as heterosexual if that emerged in the conversation. So they'd mention a husband or a wife, or they'd use she or he in a way that made it clear that the partner was of the opposite sex. But there were other people who seemed very reluctant to name or make clear the gender of the partner, which is obvious actually, isn't it? Because otherwise they'd be having to come out in public on the radio. And then Stina Eriksson's totally different subject matter. She's looking at children in Sweden, very, very young children, starting at 18 months. And she looks at the way that they're positioned by the adults around them into heteronormative positions. So that, for example, the title quotation, that is the dad and this is the mum, is the way that the adults who played with the children when they were having soft toys or Lego figures and making them into little families, that's the way they wanted them to do them, with a mum and a dad. But there was one little girl and she got 3 figures and she said, this is the mum, and this is the mum, and this is the mum. And the adult with her didn't accept that, or rather suggested an alternative. So Erickson is arguing that there's pressure from very, very early in children's lives, especially little girls' lives, to conform to ideas of heteronormativity. My lecture today takes the same approach and can be described as critical heteronormativity research from a linguistic point of view. And I'm using Heiko Motzenbacher's words there. Okay, so let's move on to language. Everyday conversation is permeated with heterosexual references, since heterosexuality has a well-developed lexicon. By drawing on this lexicon, speakers position themselves as heterosexual. Proper names and pronouns have the capacity to refer to spouses and partners in a way that's taken for granted by speakers. When everyday talk is analysed, we find that heterosexuality is naturalised, constructed as an invisible, unoriented to category, as we'll see when we look at some examples from everyday conversation. However, the discursive production of heterosexualities, the discursive production of heterosexualities involves far more than vocabulary. I shall use the term discourse both in the more linguistic sense of a way of speaking associated with a particular worldview and in the broader sense of social practice. Discourse has a key role to play in reproducing the heteronormative order. To illustrate my claims, I'll draw on a database of spontaneous conversation recorded in informal contexts and involving both same-sex and mixed groups, though the majority of the data we're going to look at tonight comes from my same-sex work. I'll also use examples from the work of other researchers in the fields of language, gender, and sexuality. My aim in this lecture is to show how speakers accomplish sexuality in their interactions, in particular to show how heterosexual speakers accomplish heterosexuality and how they orient to a dominant heteronormative discourse. I'll show how much discursive work speakers have to do in everyday conversation to maintain heteronormativity. Heterosexuality is often referred to as the unmarked case in comparison with homosexuality, but the examples I'm going to analyse show that being heterosexual takes a lot of effort, particularly linguistic effort. Before I turn to the data, I want to introduce the idea of the heteronormative hierarchy. This is a term coined by Deborah Cameron and Don Kulick. They emphasise the point that not all forms of heterosexuality are equal. They say, some expressions of heterosexuality are more equal than others. In the heteronormative hierarchy, the most favoured form of sexuality is monogamous, reproductive, and conventional in terms of gender roles. So they're making the claim that to be at the pinnacle of the heteronormative hierarchy, you need to be faithful to your partner, you need to have children and construct the nuclear family, and you need to align yourself with conventional gender norms. In my lecture today, I'll focus first on speakers who align themselves closely with dominant heteronormative discourses, and then I'll move on to look at less privileged forms of heterosexuality. In a final section, I'm going to explore the link between sexuality and gender, and we'll argue that the two cannot be disentangled. So to begin with, I'll examine the idea that some expressions of heterosexuality are more equal than others, and we'll start by analysing examples taken from the everyday talk of speakers who illustrate this most favoured form of sexuality. The first three examples come from a conversation involving two women friends, Pat and Karen. So these are examples 1 to 3 on the handout. They've been friends for many years, they're both in stable married relationships, they both have children, and they align themselves with conventional gender roles, as a full reading of their conversations demonstrates. They both then appear to be high up in the heteronormative hierarchy. How is this realised in their talk? In the first example, example 1, Karen has just arrived at her friend's house. It's a week or so before Christmas. So one of the very first things she says is, "Did you get a Christmas card from us?" "Yes, thank you." "Oh, I was looking for it everywhere this morning because Alex got the pile for hand delivery." Now, what I want you to observe in this opening question of Karen's is the pronoun us. It does important work. There is no antecedent noun to help in the recipient's understanding of who this us refers to. But Pat's answer, "Yes, thank you," displays no difficulty. The pronoun us is unproblematically assumed to refer to Karen and her husband. This is the privileged use of pronouns I talked about earlier. In the same way, Karen's use of the name Alec in her next utterance can be unproblematically assumed to tie in with the previous us and to be the name of Karen's husband. Near the end of the conversation, Pat reports her husband Dave's offer to record anything Karen and Alec might want on his new tape recorder. This conversation was recorded in the 1980s when tape recorders were considered state-of-the-art equipment. So Pat says, before you go, Dave wants you to look at this. Now he's got his new tape recorder. List is it? Dave and his list mania again. If you want anything off that, he'll record it for you. Right. He knew you wanted that Steely Dan thing. Yes, I did like that. I don't know whether Alec would like it, but... This bit of talk shows how effortlessly, in conventional everyday life, the heteronormative order is renewed. Through their frequent references to their husbands, Pat and Karen construct themselves as normatively heterosexual. The two couples demonstrate the reciprocal nature of their friendship through Alec's sending of the Christmas card and Dave's offer of recording some music. They also, notice, align themselves with conventional gender norms. It is Dave who is referred to as the owner of the tape recorder, his new tape recorder, not our new tape recorder. And that's obviously all to do with men being the people who understand technology, in some people's view. And Pat's reference to Dave and his list mania positions her in a discourse of affectionate but slightly critical domesticity. Examples 1 and 2 illustrate that even when the men are not present, the heterosexual couple is reconstructed through the wives' talk. During the conversation, so in other words, in between examples 1 and 2, the topic of the end-of-term school play comes up. Karen asks, did Peter do his song? Yes. Was he good? He was marvellous. He was marvellous. Every kid in it was marvellous. Oh, I think they always are. The reference to Peter is unproblematically understood to refer to Pat's son. This bit of dialogue shows Pat and Karen performing a dominant form of femininity, where caring about children and being a good mother are important values. And of course, these values also link them to the top of the heteronormative hierarchy. In Pat and Karen's conversation which is typical of the women friends I've recorded, talk about their husbands or their partners and children serves a homosocial function at the same time as reinforcing heteronormativity. So now I'm going to look at 3 examples that come from men's talk. The next 3 examples come from a conversation involving 2 husbands, Jeff and Chris. They're about 10 years younger than Pat and Karen. They're old friends, and they've met at an Italian restaurant to catch up with each other. That's actually quite significant. Often, when I got women to record themselves, which they always did when nothing to do with me, they would choose the home. That's where they'd record themselves. Whereas men nearly always choose somewhere outside the home. They'd choose a pub or here an Italian restaurant, or when they're younger, the youth club or a garden shed, that sort of thing. So there's a big gender difference in where people do their friendly talk. So in example 4, Jeff reminisces about meeting his partner Jax. Just before this, Chris has been talking about being boring in conversation. He says, you just notice how boring you are sometimes. And this prompts Jeff to say, it's sort of, I think back to when I first sort of met Jax. And I remember, you know, she reminds me every now and again that I spent the whole evening boring her about Billy Joel. I mean, for God's sake, I'm staggered she's still gone out with me. Note the disfluency in Jeff's first utterance. His initial, it's sort of, peters out. And then he uses the hedge sort of again before a brief pause, before finally managing to say, met Jax, which is clearly the key point. This is a brief anecdote about the first time he met the woman he eventually married. In other words, it's a classic heteronormative mini-narrative. The hedging and hesitation before the verb met suggest he may have been searching for a better, less everyday word to describe this momentous occasion in his life. Or he may just have been feeling a bit emotional. But at any rate, Jeff then works hard to minimise the importance of the story. He sort of undermines it and portrays his former self in an unflattering light and pretends surprised that Jax still wanted to go out with him. This little vignette brings Jax into the conversation and establishes Jeff's heterosexual credentials. The 2 men devote quite a lot of talking time to their jobs and their ambitions for the future. Their talk makes clear that their jobs and their ambitions have to be considered in the context of the relationship they're in, as example 5 demonstrates. I mean, you know, as far as what it's like to work at, I would stay at Clifford's, which is the law firm where he works, for the rest of my career. Once Kate gets her full-time position, I know it's a decent salary, and I mean, academic salaries are going up and up these days. So, you know, our combined earnings might be fine, and then I can stay where I am. Chris positions himself as a considerate partner who will decide whether or not to stay at Clifford's, depending on whether or not Kate, his wife, gets a full-time job and on what their combined earnings would be. This leads on to a discussion about the ideal balance in a heterosexual couple. So example 6 is the important one. Should the woman devote herself to the man and in the future to the children, or should she be a more independent person with a job of her own? So example 6 shows Jeff and Chris tussling with the reality of modern women. However much a man might think he wants the traditional marital setup with a subservient wife, they both voice doubts about the satisfaction of this in the long term. It starts with Chris saying, "But at the moment, because of the way her timescale works, I come home and sometimes she's run me a bath when I get back from the office, and she just tells me what we're having for dinner, and it's really nice to have that. But on the other hand, you know, if that was what she really wanted to do, I would kind of think, well, you know, isn't there any more to you really as a person? I can't understand how men can do it, just cope with a woman who just does that." And Jeff responds, "Yes, well, I mean, that the receptionist who was exactly that. All she wanted to do was have babies and be a housewife. You know, it's a very attractive idea at first, but, you know, it's down that line when you actually, hang on a sec, what? There must be something else to you." Throughout Chris's talk in example 6, the pronouns she and her are used to refer to Chris's wife, Kate, and the pronoun we refers to Chris and Kate, the heterosexual couple. This use of pronouns relies on an understanding that in a heteronormative world, some pronouns are privileged. Speakers perform heterosexuality through the ubiquitous yet unnoticed use of discourse features such as this. Notice also Chris's casual references to mundane details of his life as a married man. So he says, "She's run me a bath when I get back from the office." So positions man in the office, woman at home. "She just tells me what we're having for dinner. Woman the cook, man the eater." These not only construct and maintain heteronormativity, but they also construct conventional gender roles, with Chris, the man, coming home from the office, and Kate, the wife, running baths and making meals. Chris aligns himself further with heteronormativity with the utterance, "I can't understand how men can do it, just cope with a woman who just does that," where he positions himself in a discourse world where relationships between men and women are central. An utterance such as, "I can't understand how men can do it, just cope with a man who just does that," would be greeted with incomprehension. Jeff's subsequent description of the receptionist at the place where he works, all she wanted to do was have babies and be a housewife, also appeals to a heteronormative understanding of the world, which relies on strict gender normativity. But he goes on to problematize this, positioning himself as a new man who would want his wife to have something else to her. And here, obviously, he echoes Chris's words, "Isn't there any more to you?" Examples 1 to 6 all perform a very settled conventional heterosexuality, drawing on dominant heteronormative discourses. The speakers in these examples are monogamous and conventional in terms of gender roles, to go back to Cameron and Kulick's words. Pat and Karen talk about Pat's son Peter and his song in the school play, and Jeff raises the question of babies, so these speakers can also be said to be potentially reproductive. Thus, they fit Cameron and Kulick's criteria for the most favoured form of heteronormativity. All seem content with the status quo, though Jeff and Chris, who are younger than Pat and Karen, remember, are still prepared to discuss variation in wifehood. Interestingly, they do not consider any variation in the role of husband. Now I want to move on to less favoured forms of heterosexuality. Heterosexual relationships which are not monogamous, which do not produce children and therefore do not establish the normative nuclear family, and which do not conform to conventional gender roles, are less favoured. I shall now look at some examples involving speakers whose expression of heterosexuality is less equal, to use Cameron and Kulick's words. Speakers lower down the heteronormative hierarchy can maintain a heteronormative discourse in two ways. They can condemn those who demonstrate these less favoured forms of heterosexuality, or they can position themselves in a resistant discourse which challenges the heteronormative hierarchy while still maintaining heteronormativity. In example 7, 4 young male friends discuss a non-present friend whose girlfriend has cheated on him. The strong emotions expressed here demonstrate how serious the men judge this betrayal to be. Their shared reactions serve to bond them in reasserting the importance of fidelity in a monogamous relationship. I won't read this, I'll let you read this yourselves. Not because I'm a coward, but just because I haven't ever heard it, because I came across it in the work of the sociologists Goff and Edwards, and it's probably in a Manchester accent anyway, so I'll let you read it for yourselves. It's widely recognised that hegemonic masculinity is closely linked to heterosexuality. These men's use of taboo language, fucking, fuck off, etc., performs a dominant form of masculinity, as does Dave's appeal to violence. I'm sorry, but I'd go fucking mad if I saw that. Knock fuck out the pair of them, throw them out the window. Goff and Edwards comment on this extract from their data as follows. For a woman to engage in extra-relationship sex, then, is seemingly to undermine one's sense of masculinity. In fact, I would argue that this comment understates the seriousness of the woman's extra-relationship sexual adventure. Her sexual relationship with another man undermines not just her partner's masculinity, but also heteronormativity itself. A very different challenge to heteronormativity comes from those who remain single. These are 3 women friends in their 30s talking at Sue's house. And Anna says, the other 2 are married, and Anna is on her own. Anna says, I just sometimes think I probably never will get married again or never be with anybody again because I just love my life on my own. Note how Anna still performs as heterosexual despite positioning herself in a resistant discourse. She mentions marriage. Her use of the word again signals that she used to be married, and she broadens marriage to include any relationship involving being with somebody, implicitly a male somebody. Anna represents a new version of heterosexual femininity, a woman who has tried marriage, who is financially independent, and who makes a conscious decision to stay single. The most striking aspect of her independence is that she does not have and does not seem to want children. So this is example 9. She says, can I just ask you 2 as mothers, did you used to feel particularly fond of children before you had them? And Sue and Liz both say, no. And Anna goes on, because Janet and I without children were, you did feel a bit mean sometimes, but I just can't understand that assumption that people have, that everybody loves children. This very honest discussion among the 3 friends reflects an unusual and non-heteronormative view of children and of women's maternal instincts. Sue and Liz agree that they did not feel particularly fond of children before they had them, while Anna, bringing in her childless friend Janet to strengthen her position, states explicitly that neither of them understands why it's assumed that everybody loves children. However, note how she protects her face by adding, you did feel a bit mean sometimes. Anna, here in the safety of her friend's home, adopts a resistant discourse which positions her as deviant, as outside the norms. A third heteronormative assumption is that proper femininity and proper masculinity are indispensable elements of ideal heterosexuality. Ideas of what is proper vary according to socio-historical context, of course. In example 6, we saw Jeff and Chris discussing 2 conflicting versions of femininity, one the stay-at-home wife and mother, the other the modern career woman who has a mind of her own. But while a woman may have a mind of her own, the role of wife entails an often unconscious acceptance of asymmetry in the marital relationship. In conversation with her 2 friends, Sue introduces a new topic involving a couple she knows. What makes this couple interesting is that the wife has forbidden the husband to have a guitar. The idea that a wife might control her husband's behaviour to the extent of banning a musical instrument clearly shocks her and her 2 friends. Now, this one is not on the overhead because it's a bit complicated. I'll put it on the handout, though. And I'll read it, though obviously it's in stave format, just like musical instruments in a stave, and it shows you the way the voices overlap with each other. But when I read it, I'll obviously just read the main strand. Sue said, his wife wouldn't let him have a guitar. She said no, and he's so obedient. She said, you're not having a guitar. So he didn't have one. He just didn't play it ever. But you've got to see it to believe it, because he's just obedient. And she, why did you use that word? That's a dreadful word. What, obedient? Obedient. Makes him sound like a pet rabbit. Yes, but he is. That's what he's like. He's obedient. He just does as she says. Liz's words, like a pet rabbit, and Sue's statements, he's obedient, he just does as she says, are met by Anna's response, oh, how awful. It is the idea of the husband's obedience to the wife's strictures that so disturbs the three friends. This does not fit their ideas of a proper man or of a proper wife. Sue does complain from time to time about her husband's saxophone playing, but it is clear that she would never contemplate banning the instrument and would be appalled if he obeyed her over something like that. It's interesting to note that it's not so long ago that women had to promise to obey their new husband as part of the marriage service. While this is now seen as old-fashioned, clearly the notion of obedience is still highly salient, as the reverse idea of a man obeying a woman appears to be deeply shocking to this group of women. At the time of the royal wedding, Kate and William's decision to omit the obeying part of the marriage service was widely commented on, mostly in positive terms, as symbolic of a more modern, symmetrical relationship. But the fact that the media considered it worth commenting on suggests that choosing to omit the obeying part is still marked. Overt pressure to be a proper man or a proper woman is most clearly visible in the talk of younger speakers. In the formative teenage years, anyone who appears to be deviating from the heteronormative path will be subjected to strong peer pressure to conform. In the next example, example 11, we see Pierre, who's only 14 years old, under pressure from his male classmates during a small group discussion of Tennyson's poem, The Lady of Shalott. And again, I'll let you read this yourselves. Pierre here is trying to do what the teacher has asked them to do, to discuss the poem. He thus positions himself as out of alignment with dominant norms of young masculinity, which see school as a feminized arena. The other boys in the group, Andy and Kirk, make no attempt to talk about the poem. Their attacks on Pierre rise to a crescendo, culminating in the direct accusation that he is like a queer, the last line. It seems that by orienting to the school's value system and trying to engage with poetry, Pierre's performance of masculinity fails in the eyes of the peer group. Boys of this age struggle to avoid being accused of being gay, but this means that it is very difficult for them to engage seriously with academic tasks. Frosch and his colleagues comment in their study of teenage boys in secondary school that homophobia is one clear marker of much emergent masculinity in this age group, suggesting that the struggle to establish oneself as normatively heterosexual is a very significant feature of identity formation for these boys. Now to move on to parallel, well, they're not parallel, but a group of girls. Example 12 shows peer group pressure to conform not in the educational setting, but at home in a girl's bedroom. This group of teenage friends have known each other for many years and are good friends, but this does not mean there are no tensions around heterosexual topics and accompanying gender norms. The girls in example 12 consider Helen's statement that her friend Simon claims that she doesn't go for boys, with the homophobic implication that maybe she goes for girls. This one again is on the handout, yes. Every time Simon comes round to my house, he sits down and he says, Helen, there's been some rumours going round about you. You know, that you don't go for boys. Oh yeah, you've told us this before. What did you say? I said, that's not true. There just aren't any boys worth going for. It's true, it's so true. And he'll say, well, you can have me. Well, he would. What's wrong with that anyway? You've still got Joel, Tom, Joe or Harry. I might not have anyone to go out with, but I'm not fucking desperate yet, Margot. Helen presumably discloses this story to her friends in the hope of getting some support. While Emma's statement, it's true though, it's so true, is supportive, she subsequently joins in with Ruth and Margot, who seem less inclined to listen seriously to Helen. Ruth cuts across Emma with an imagined utterance from Simon, well, you can have me, while Margot suggests that there are plenty of eligible males. You've still got Joel, Tom, Joe or Harry, with its echoes of the phrase Tom, Dick or Harry. At this point, it's this point that Helen gets angry and exclaims, I might not have anyone to go out with, but I'm not fucking desperate yet, Margot. This is the unhappy response of a girl pushed to conform to heteronormative ideas of proper femininity and going out with boys. This extract illustrates vividly the pressure on girls to conform to heteronorms by going out with a male someone. I can remember when I was that age, and my best friend and I, we both invented boyfriends, both called Peter, just so that we could talk about a boyfriend so that we would fit in. This is a group of intelligent middle-class girls who do not see themselves as slaves to convention, yet their talk shows how uncomfortable it is for one of them to resist the norms. They are caught between their awareness of the fact that there just aren't any boys worth going for and the pressures of heteronormativity. One thing that becomes clear in a survey of contemporary heterosexualities is that gender is a significant variable and that gender and sexuality are inextricably linked. The linguistic features that index femininity and masculinity also index heterosexual identity because, as Cameron and Kulick put it, of the crucial role played by compulsory heterosexuality in the construction of gender identity and gender relations. Heterosexuality is an indispensable element of contemporary femininities and masculinities. In this last section, I'll give a brief overview of male and female heterosexualities, which have been amply illustrated in the examples discussed so far, but not specifically focused on. Where male speakers are involved, the heterosexual discourses drawn on are aligned with discourses of dominant masculinities, sometimes laddish, sometimes heroic, celebrating achievements, and more concerned with the external life of the subject than with their internal life. Women are often absent from all male talk, but when women are present in the talk, they are frequently referred to in a misogynistic way. Male speakers often draw on a misogynistic discourse which reduces women to body parts, as I was showing on example 13. This example comes from a conversation involving the same male university students as in example 7, and note how the men compete with each other to come up with better images. Again, I'll let you read this yourselves. The othering of women is done to reassure and validate masculinity, and it would be easy to describe this sort of laddish talk as just letting off steam. But as Goff and Edwards say, that would be to deny the expectations and even pressures on men towards heterosexual performance in the company of other men. It's probably the case that these younger males feel the need to talk so much about women to compensate for the fact that they're relatively low down in the heterosexual hierarchy. They're not in long-term monogamous relationships. They have no children. So their only option is to exaggerate their masculinity through drawing on a sexist and misogynistic discourse. By contrast, examples like 4, 5 and 6, which we looked at involving Jeff and Chris talking over a meal, display a more measured masculinity. Because their heterosexuality is secure, they're both married, they have no need to draw on misogynistic discourses, but instead position themselves within a firmly heteronormative discourse where discussion of wives and possible children can sit alongside talk about jobs, technological skills, and adventures on motorbikes. All of these were in that conversation. These two men are high up in the heteronormative hierarchy and are thus under less pressure than the students in example 13 to exaggerate their masculinity. Now to turn to women, female heterosexuals in Talk with Friends position themselves discursively as heterosexual through frequent references to the men in their lives and to children. In my database of same-sex talk, there's nothing in the women's talk to match the laddish misogyny of much all-male talk. We find affectionate talk about husbands and boyfriends side by side with complaints about men. While the women in the many conversations in my database are positioned in a variety of ways, as women who love men, as women who are critical of men, as women who prefer to live alone, they all share the dominant worldview in which heterosexual relations are seen as the norm. The construction of themselves as feminine involves simultaneously the construction of themselves as heterosexual. One of the interesting differences between male and female heterosexualities is the discontent that often surfaces in all-female talk. This varies widely from Pat's affectionate Dave and his list mania again, which was example 2, to Helen's comment, there just aren't any boys worth going for, example 12. Other examples in my corpus include complaints about husbands staying late at the pub with friends, or, more seriously, about ex-husbands making life very unpleasant in the divorce courts. The conversations I've recorded show women struggling to reconcile their perception of men's deficiencies with their unquestioning acceptance of the heteronormative order. So, to conclude then, in this lecture I've focused on the role of talk in reproducing the heteronormative order. My aim has been to queer heterosexuality in the sense of exposing it to view and querying its unmarked status. I've drawn on Cameron and Kulick's concept of the heteronormative hierarchy to identify the key characteristics of heteronormativity as being monogamous, having children, and adopting conventional gender roles. It's 33 years since Adrian Rich first used the phrase compulsory heterosexuality. This had a significant impact on feminist thinking, but it has made little impression on the dominant discourses circulating in society. As Celia Kitzinger and Sue Wilkinson remark, the relentless tyranny of the heterosexual assumption continues unabated. By treating heterosexuality as a taken for granted of everyday life, we deny ourselves the possibility of choice. I've shown how speakers in everyday conversation do a great deal of discursive work to position themselves in heteronormative space. Heteronormativity constrains our agency by asserting the naturalness of heterosexuality and by concealing the cultural work that has to be done to maintain it. My aim in this lecture has been to make this cultural work more visible. Thank you. I was wondering what this handing over of things was, but
Yeah, plenty of time for questions.
if people want to ask questions, and then just ask for one of these microphones.
Hi, thanks Jane very much for this lecture. And I just wanted to ask a question which perhaps would invite you to compare a little bit of the work that you're doing now with your previous work on language and gender. I mean, you've talked a lot also as part of this lecture about how gender and sexuality are interlinked. But a lot of us will actually be very, very familiar with your language and gender work, whether that's in women's collaboration or women's narratives presenting themselves as experts. And I just wonder whether you've been recently revisiting some of this work.
Well, yes, it's been an absolute revelation. And it's one of those things that often happens in social science research, that suddenly a new idea arrives and you cannot imagine how you didn't think it before. It's obvious that gender and sexuality are tightly intertwined, but we just focused on gender in the 70s and 80s, and then in the 90s it began to shift. And it just hugely improves our understanding of gender and how people construct themselves as masculine or feminine, because they're constructing themselves as heterosexual feminine or masculinely heterosexual. The two things are deeply intertwined. One of the things that it's really answered for me, in answer to Pierre's question, is that I was always really frustrated when I was originally working in language and gender, that as the 80s and 90s wore on, there was this feeling that unless you could really, really show that the speakers themselves position themselves as gendered, you weren't really supposed to say these are women or these are men. You were supposed to show that there was evidence, so that they would say, well, as a woman, I'd like to say, well, then you've got the evidence. But it didn't happen. I mean, it's really, really unusual for women or men to identify as gendered like that, certainly in everyday relaxed talk with their friends. So that was a stumbling block, because very slowly the term essentialist became a dirty word and you were desperate to avoid it. On the other hand, if, like me, you'd collected talk from women who, when I asked them in ethnographic interviews, would it have made any difference if men joined your group of friends? They all went, yeah, it would have been the same at all. I mean, they were very, very aware that they were women talking with their women friends. It's just they didn't actually express that in words. Now, once you include heterosexuality as part of the picture for gender, you can see that people are performing themselves as heterosexual all over the place. Well, much more than they're specifically revealing that they're thinking of themselves as gender in the middle of a bit of talk. The heterosexual thing, sexuality seems to be much more salient. So that talk about partners or babies or families in general comes up a lot, and suddenly makes me see that that's one of the reasons we couldn't see. Where's the evidence? It's because we weren't looking at sexuality. We were only looking at gender.
I was wondering if the participants in the conversations that you recorded heard this analysis of the conversation, and if so, what was their reaction?
Are you meaning this particular presentation?
The examples that you gave.
Yes, the examples I'm using here, have they heard this interpretation? No. But, I mean, when I transcribed the data initially, I did send them transcripts. I also sent them copies of the tapes that they'd sent me. And I said, let me know if you want me to send you papers. So I've always kept in touch with them. But most of them, they lose interest very quickly. It's strange. Initially, they might be a bit anxious about participating. But then, as soon as they are assured that they'll be anonymized, though actually some of the younger people said I had to use their names. So people can go both ways. No, what would you think? Do you think they might react badly?
I would just be interested in whether they would dispute your analysis on it, and on what grounds they would dispute it. But if we don't know.
We can't know, no. I'm sure I could think of I started my work with my own group of women friends. This is always seen as a very shocking story because I recorded them whenever we met, which was roughly once every 4 weeks. And I didn't tell them I was recording them. This was back in the early 80s, and it was still seen as a perfectly normal thing to do. The Survey of English Usage was doing it at University College, I hasten to add. And but then, of course, I in the end told them, and they have read everything I've written, and I see them frequently because they still exist as a women's group. So in that sense, nobody's ever said to me that was a ridiculous interpretation there, though I was concentrating on gender at that point, of course. Maybe that's less controversial. But it'd be interesting to see. I'll have to send them this paper.
It was interesting that you started with the royal wedding. David Cameron, when he was asked why as a conservative is he in support of same-sex marriage, he said it's because I'm a conservative that I'm in support of same-sex marriage. And I've heard people from the sort of queer theory end of things say that one thing same-sex marriage does is further the heteronormative narrative. I'd be interested to know what you think about that.
Yes, I think that's a really tricky one. I think on the basis of equality, there's no question then that same-sex marriage seems like a good idea. On the other hand, you can obviously make the case that there is heteronormative pressure, perhaps, or heteronormative discourses surrounding all of us, and therefore maybe that's why people feel they want to do this thing that the normative people do. I think what's even more interesting is people like Lord Tebbit, who doesn't seem to be able to understand the concept of same-sex marriage at all, to the extent that he's saying, if we're not careful, we'll be having a lesbian queen, and then if she's... I've got it, actually, if you'd like to see it. he said, when we have a queen who is a lesbian and she marries another lady and then decides she would like to have a child, and someone donates sperm and she gives birth to a child, is that child heir to the throne? I mean, it's like they tie themselves up in knots. Any other questions?
I'm interested in these first three extracts.
Yes.
And in the difference between marking heterosexuality and marking coupledom with children.
Yes.
And I was wondering whether you've done similar recordings among groups of women who were in lesbian relationships with children, and whether there are differences or whether it looks fairly similar.
That's a really good question, and it's one of the sadnesses of my career, that whenever I have tried to get groups of lesbian friends, for example, together, or gay men, I have failed. I have got some data from Australia, but I haven't used it in this talk involving heterosexual and lesbian women. Yes, that's a good point. I'm sure there are places where it wouldn't look very different, especially where a lesbian couple has chosen to have children. But I still think, I wonder if you'd find that there are, but maybe you'd disagree, maybe you'd find that things like gender normativity, that's where the couple, I suppose there's a couple of women living together and they've got children, maybe it would be in terms of gender normativity that they'd be pushing the boundaries. I mean, maybe they would, I don't know, swear more, I don't know, no, maybe not, no. Yes, it's really sad that I don't know whether there's been any good work. There is work, but I'm afraid not enough yet to really look at sort of domestic, everyday talk among, say, gay women. Oh, there's someone at the very back.
Have you got any evidence on the basis of their education, whether they're in single-sex schools or heterosexual, mixed schools, as to whether the sort of language used is any different?
Well, I think that certainly teenagers in mixed comprehensive have a very hard time, as you can see from the example of Pierre trying to discuss poetry. And Frosch and his colleagues did this wonderful work on young masculinities and showed that it's a very tough time for boys at present, because they're stuck really. If they want to perform masculinity well, then that means exaggerating their masculinity, and that means that they find it very hard to do things which they see as feminine, such as, well, discussing poetry is obviously at one extreme, but conforming to school norms, listening to the teacher, doing their homework even, talking in class. So, and there is some suggestion that boys that go to single-sex privileged schools do avoid some of this this difficulty of the whole, if you have to spend all day monitoring yourself so to avoid the accusation of being gay, it must be extremely wearing and obviously have a very detrimental effect on how you construct yourself as masculine. But apparently, I can't remember now where I read it, but there is evidence that people in probably private schools, single sex, the boys do better and are able to participate fully in classroom discussion.
Hiya, thanks for that, that was really interesting. I had a question about, sorry, is that okay, volume?
Yes.
Yeah. I had a question about the heteronormative hierarchy. So I was struck by examples 13 and 9. So with example 13, what occurred to me when we were discussing it was that often when men do something really bad, like assault someone or kill someone or whatever, then the sort of media discourse that will arise in discussion of that will be something like something along the lines of, well, boys will be boys, or that's just what guys do, and it can't be helped. And so I guess I just wondered if when you were talking about this exaggerated masculinity and misogyny as compensating for being low down in the heteronormative hierarchy, whether there's also an extent to which perhaps that position in the heteronormative hierarchy becomes kind of idealised or romanticised or something in public discourse. And with example 9, whether, sorry, I didn't mean this to become 2 questions, but I wondered if there was a generational issue there. So among my peers, a lot of my peers getting married and having children, and among my peers who aren't getting married and having children, it's very popular to hate children, to an extent that I find quite shocking and disproportionate, even if you're female.
Okay, there were 2 things there. I do think that if Cameron Kulick's idea of a heteronormative hierarchy holds good, and I think it's a very plausible idea, then it does make a lot of sense that people who are low down in the hierarchy, in other words, they're not in a monogamous relationship and they haven't got children, that they would then exaggerate their masculinity and that they would perform things like example 13, for example, just to prove to each other that they're real men and to show how much, but at the same time to show how they understand the heteronormative discourses that we're all positioned in, and to say it's wrong to have an affair. So it's like it contributes in more than one way. And then your other point was number 9, wasn't it? Oh yes. Were you saying that you think it's now relatively normal for women to say rude things about having children?
I think among women of a certain demographic, I think it probably is, and whether that's sort of a generational thing, or women of a particular age, or
I think there's still huge pressure on women to ooh and ah over babies and to whatever they really feel. It would only be backstage, and truly backstage, I think that they would talk like the women here in number 9. I mean, this is a very, very safe environment, so she's able to express that. I find it hard to believe that there'd be people so openly going against the conventional norms. But maybe I'm out of date. I think it's time we all went for a drink. One more? Okay.
My question sort of links in with the one before in a way, which I didn't know was coming. The examples you've got here for the under 30s, you've got 2 from a group of 4 students, male students, and you've got one in Northern Comprehensive. The only one for females under 30 is Emma and her friends, and I wondered whether, as that person said before, whether it would have been very enlightening and fruitful to have more material showing younger females' views in a group of different aspects, and also with, sorry, this is also a 2-parter, whether there might be more swearing involved, because at the end of that female conversation, the girl says she isn't that desperate, she swears, and whether there might be more of that in, say, more student-age conversations.
On the whole, in the data I've looked at and in the data other people have collected, there's less swearing in women's talk. I mean, I know it's a stereotype, but there does seem to be some truth to it. And yes, your point about it not being very parallel, that's because it wasn't meant to be a cheat. What it was I was looking for places where people either challenged ideas like monogamy or gender norms, or ideas where they resisted the discourse in some way. And it just so happened that this was the way I was able to illustrate it, because, so in a way, I'm asking you to take on trust that I know my database inside out, and the women's ones did not support. You know, the women didn't talk in a sweary way about men and in a, you know, an anti-men sort of way. They were mostly, they'd sometimes complain, but on the whole, they're very, they obviously are very respectful of men. Whereas it's the men, and there's lots and lots of good sociological research with horrible, horrible extracts of men talking about women.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much.